makes it easier because then we don't have to record.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, those files get really big.
Oh, I bet they do.
Okay, and check the music because then we don't have to record.
Yeah.
All right, so we are live, so we can get started.
Cool.
Thank you for joining us, whether it is today and you're watching us live or whether you're checking us out after we're all done talking here. It might be a smaller type of discussion today, but I have a very special guest with me. It's the first time he's been here. And it's a really fascinating topic that I think we can take a lot of angles on. And I know I come at this more from psychology and communication studies, so I'll happily take that angle. But Mike, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves and tell us why you're here today to talk about rituals and traditions in popular culture.
Well, absolutely. So hello, everybody out there in internet land. My name is Michael Denman. I am an adjunct professor at the College of Southern Nevada in Las Vegas, Nevada. My background is in history and religious studies, and I sort of pop all over the place in my interests, but one of my interests is absolutely in this realm of how religion manifests in various cultural activities, and in this case, pop culture, which is why I'm here today.
And I'm like, ooh, yes, because I also am interested in religion and fandom and how those intersect.
Ooh, yes.
It's another great aspect here.
I'm sure we'll talk about that today, absolutely.
Definitely. So maybe an interesting point to start at is how we define these things, like how we see what ritual is, how we see what tradition is, maybe even how we see what religion is.
Oh my gosh.
For me, I'm not a religious person. And I come at this topic more from a psychology and communication perspective. And one of my favorite theories is uses and gratifications. And I was just telling my young undergraduates about this. We were talking about how, sometimes we get into these habits with the media that we use, and it becomes kind of a ritual. And I think if you look at this from a fan studies perspective, we have these ideas that at like the core, fandom is you repeatedly returning to something. So you repeatedly engaging with it to the point then where, at least when I was growing up, every week you tune into the television at the same channel, same time. And it was like this ritual of consumption. And then it can involve other things as well. Like maybe it's a ritual to buy certain products or to buy the fanfic or, whatever it is that you're doing. And we've talked on this podcast or dialogue before about how fandoms can become these traditions that are passed down within a family, and they almost become in some ways ritual too. Like maybe the family will always watch or engage with the same piece of pop culture at the specific time of the year and things like that. Like my partner and I, we love watching Christmas movies at Christmas, but we also love watching not like traditional ones. So it's always like Krampus or Die Hard. That's
nice.
Our tradition. So to me, it then can become a religion, I guess, like with a fandom, if enough people engage in those rituals and are organized and connected with the others who are doing it. So when I approach this topic, I'm kind of taking that angle to it. So
absolutely.
How you see it, though, coming from a history and religious studies perspective?
I mean, all three of these concepts and terminologies, right? Religion, tradition, and ritual. And this is one of those classic scenarios where scholars have been arguing about these definitions for hundreds of years at this point, right? And we're still no closer to everyone agreeing. But I think one of the key aspects behind all three of these is absolutely what you bring up, in that there is this sort of repetition, right? And this sort of adherence to the process that is very critical to all three of these things and ties all three of these things together. Because, I mean, in sort of the historical, the historiography of working on these ideas of ritual, one of the things that really developed that people kept coming back to was this, consistent structured practice, right? That there's a consistent structured activity that defines what we call ritual, right?
Mhm.
And so when I think about a lot of these ideas of sort of ritual and religion and stuff like that, it is very much this idea of the practice of it, right? It's all practice based, which is, something that's become very popular in thinking about ritual since like the late 80s. But that, I think of ritual in sort of my own way too, these personal little markers that I use for my own personal timelines, right? That definitely involve pop culture. Like one of the things that I used to do all the time before technology kind of put a damper on it with the processes that they go through, every year when it got close to the beginning of the school year, right? So like mid-August, roughly, I would always replay Warcraft 3. That was like my thing. That was my tradition, right? That was my ritual. I would always replay Warcraft 3 right as that got close to the beginning of the school year, every year, like clockwork. And it just became this thing that I used as sort of a marker of time, right? As this transition into this next phase of the calendar for myself.
I like that idea of like the marker. And I think definitely popular culture serves that purpose for a lot of people and fandoms in particular, because you're able to think back over your life and you can recall that at that time this was very important to you and why it was important to you, and it helps you to make sense of who you were then, who you are now, and things like that. I also think it's interesting you mentioned the structure and how important the concept of structure is to ritual. Why do you think it had well, how do I want to put this? Why do we like structure?
It's a really good question, right? And I think the psychology background there is really gonna sort of take the reins on helping us think about that. There's of course I'm gonna almost blank on it now, but I think it's called the ethological approach, is what I want to say it is, that looks at ritual being defined by cognitive processes, right? That ritual isn't something that we created per se socially or culturally, but there's something ingrained, right, deep in our psyche, in the processes of the mind, that is where ritual stems from, right? So folks that have done ethological type studies have looked to nature, have looked to animals, right, and the way that they do things, whether it's deer butting heads in that sort of physical contest, or birds with their mating rituals, right, mating dances, that perhaps there is something that resides deep in our fleshy brain meat that really drives our desire for ritual and our desire for structure.
That makes sense. It's I like that you brought up like mating rituals, because I was just thinking that rituals and traditions are very meaning laden. Like
yes.
So I think one of the reasons why they seem to matter for us and they can operate as these personal markers is because of the meanings that we attach to them, whether it's socially, culturally, or even individually, like playing World of Warcraft 3. But then when animals are showing dominance over one another, or they're doing a mating dance and things like that, there's meaning, I suppose, but it's not like how we think of meaning in this larger symbolic, this transcendence of the ritual to a higher state of mind.
Sure.
Do you think then that while we have commonalities maybe with thinking about what birds and other animals do, what is it specifically about how humans do rituals and traditions that makes them matter for us?
Well, that sort of leads us to if we're sort of putting together a list of things that help define tradition and ritual, right? We have the repetition aspect. We have this sort of a sort of processional aspect, right, or structural aspect. And then the third question becomes purpose, right? Like, what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve by doing these things? And, when we look at sort of the animal world, it's very sort of, almost what we might call surface level approaches, right? Mating, dominance, basic processes like that. But for us in our exceedingly complex human culture, right, the purposes of any particular ritual may heavily differ, right? We may do it to try and create some sort of outcome if we think sort of like healing practices or sort of religious rituals like that, or we may do it to mark time, calendar rituals. We may do it to change through processes of society, right? Rites of passage, initiation rituals, things like that. And I think a lot of it comes back down to the fact that, whether or not we want to take in this sort of biological cognitive aspect or not, that we crave structure and understanding of purpose because ultimately the world is so chaotic, right? Nothing is guaranteed in life, right? That anything could happen tomorrow, and it's just all over. So, we are consistently faced with this existential knowledge that everything is impermanent, right? And so ritual, tradition, and religion, right, they offer us a structure wherein we can create meaning out of chaos, and we can create purpose out of things that inherently may not have any purpose, because on the one hand it helps us get through the day right, without having an existential breakdown every minute.
Well, and I think that makes a lot of sense as a way to separate humans from other animals too. I think as far as we know, and who knows if we're going to have a breakthrough on this, we're the only animal in the entire universe that has that awareness of the impending end of things. We know that animals, and to an extent even plants will definitely react to pain, and animals can sense when something bad is going to happen and they will react in that moment. But as far as we know, none of them are become aware at some point of, oh, hey, I'm going to die at some point. It's like uniquely human. And so I remember in my cultural psychology class, we talked about how apes have societies, but they don't have cultures. Because you can, in an ape society, you can see the passing down of knowledge, like how to perform tasks and whatnot. But we don't have any sense that they're ascribing these higher levels of meaning to these tasks. So there's no storytelling, there's no myth making or anything like that.
Sure.
So any rituals seem to stay at the more basic goals, which are, I mean, like you were just saying, all our rituals all stem from those same types of basic goals. But because of our cognitive abilities, we start to add more storytelling and myth making to them, so that they play a role in helping us cope with the existential crisis of life.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, that sort of main difference is a lot of those, functional rituals of, say, apes are functional, right? This passing down of knowledge, the process whereby, they do all these things has like a very direct, like useful functional purpose, right? Teach younger members of the group how to survive, right? Protect the group, these very, very basic things. Whereas humans, we create things like movies and music and, super complicated holidays where you have to go through, hoops and hoops and hoops just to make sure everything's done right. That, ultimately has no greater purpose other than the ritual itself, right? Like the ritual itself is the whole point, right? Rather than any functional benefit of the outcome of it.
Is that true though? I mean, do we have times where we engage with the ritual just to engage with the ritual? Because I'm thinking of I mean, I work at a Catholic university, and
Okay,
so
sure.
some of our functions, I see people are, you know, taking mass and whatnot, or communion and so forth.
Right.
And I watch them. And part of my understanding of communion, let me know if I'm wrong. And Princess popped up for a moment. Princess is hopefully coming in soon. She can maybe help me with this as well. My understanding of communion is you take the wafer and the blood as a representation of the body of Christ. But the meaning that is ascribed to it then is it helps you to transcend body, the material, to get more in touch with the spiritual, which is what God is meant to represent.
Yes.
But what I don't know is then, are there Catholics who take communion just because it's, you know, habit? Do they always think about these matters? Are they always engaging with the higher meaning? I mean, I don't know. And
That's a good question.
yeah, Princess, just to catch you up, we've been talking about what are ritual and tradition and how to define these things. And we're at the point now where we're trying to understand if humans are engaging in ritual, not just for the functional purpose that they serve in life, like how animals might engage in mating dances and dominance displays and whatnot, then are humans always engaging with ritual, aware of the meaning or focusing on the meaning? Are they doing it just out of habit? I mean, how do humans engage with rituals, I guess, is the question.
I think a lot of it is out of habit, like you brought up the communion, Catholic community. And a couple of days ago, I went to mass. It has been a long time since I went to mass because I grew up Catholic. And then they were giving out communion, and it was habit for me to just get up and go to the line to communion and take it. So a lot of it is habits. And I don't think a lot of us humans, when we engage in traditions and rituals, sometimes we lose the meaning of why we are doing these traditions and rituals.
No, absolutely. And like that's a big question that, you know, has really driven a lot of the scholarship on ritual and myth and these types of things is how often are people really sort of thinking about these meanings? You know what I mean? Like how often on a scale of like never to all the time are people actively thinking, I am doing this with a religious purpose. I am consuming the God and, you know, this whole thing. And how much of it is like, and you just show up to mass on Sunday morning and you sit there and you listen and you go up and you do the thing and because that's just what you do, right? How often are people really sort of engaging at this sort of higher level, which, I mean, who knows, right? You know, it's such a person, and then it brings in the personal aspect of everything, right? That obviously rituals sort of work on this larger social level, but there's also the personal aspect as well, right? Like when I was thinking, when I said that bit about, you know, sort of going through these hoops and doing things just for the sake of doing them, my mind had started to drift into, you know, maybe what we might call more of a tradition, but I think we may, you know, if we looked at it, it has ritual aspects to it. I was thinking of like family gatherings at Thanksgiving, right? And like everyone's got their role. Everyone's, you know, there's all these hoops, there's all these specific things going on that everybody has to do. And it's you know, depending on your family and whatnot, like it's a lot of time sink. It's a lot of energy to sink into this thing. That's going to take like, you know, 6 hours, you know, 3 weeks of planning for 6 hours for this thing, you know? So yeah, it's really hard to say, I guess, what, you know, at any given time, how sort of like deep someone is thinking about the activity that they're doing.
Yeah, it makes me wonder again from a psychological perspective, if the engagement with the more meaningful aspects of a ritual or tradition might occur more if a person is in a situation where they're feeling some uncertainty or they're feeling the chaos of life, that existential, I don't want to say crisis, but, you know, existential nudging that's going on. And it might be that at that time they engage with it, but otherwise, given how much we have to deal with on a daily basis, if there are rituals that we don't need that type of meaningfulness, maybe we're just going through the motions at that time.
Right. Yeah. And that brings back into the process or back into the discussion, the whole structure and repetition aspect, right? Because, you know, if we're particularly thinking about, you know, if we bring in the religious context of ritual, you know, so much of the idea around it is like, you have to do it this way in this particular procedure, because if you don't, you're going to screw it up, right? And it's going to cause problems if we screw it up, right? We're going to anger the gods, or we're not going to get rain the way we're supposed to, or whatever it is, right? So you have to do it just this exact way, because it's the process that's important rather than the meaning, right? So now we once again, we get back into that issue, right? Is it the meaning, or is it the process, right? Is it the function? Is it the structure that's really driving ritual?
Well, the Protestants will agree with that. Will say that it's the meaning, not the ritual. The process is they don't, the Protestants don't keep a lot of the Catholic traditions. So they are like, why do we need all this ritual and ceremony
Absolutely.
and process to talk to God when we can just go talk to God ourselves? So the Protestants agree with that. Some Protestants, but you have the Episcopalians and some Lutheran groups that do keep a lot of those Catholic traditions.
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely something, if we're thinking on the historical timeline and sort of the impact of how, you know, we think of these things, even if we're not religious, right? Our particular sort of understanding of religion in the modern day is so deeply impacted by the ideas of the Protestant Revolution. I mean, particularly here in America, right? With our overall Protestant background, right? That belief is more important than the action, right? And we can absolutely use Catholicism and Protestantism as the two sides of the coin, right? Where in Catholicism, the ritual, the process, the action is very central to the experience of the religion. Whereas in Protestantism, especially as you sort of go along a little bit more and more and more in the timeline, it is like belief. That is the central core aspect above anything else, right? If you believe in Jesus as the savior, at the end of the day, nothing else really matters, right? It's the belief that is core, you know what I mean? Which obviously we could get into a whole slew of technical issues with that, but that is the main difference, right? Is that focal point of belief, which, you know, once again, we can also examine ritual from these two aspects as well, right? And going back deeper into history, this becomes a thing too, right? Is that it was, you know, the structure, the process is so very central to the outcome of the ritual, right? It is very key, very central to what happens. Whereas in a more modern day context, we don't necessarily see that as being the case. To borrow, because one of the other things that I'm really been interested in a lot recently is like New Age stuff, like the New Age philosophy, New Age religion movement, particularly in the 21st century. And so, to borrow a term from the New Age movement, right, it's intention. It's all about intention, right? It doesn't matter exactly what you do. It doesn't matter the process, blah, 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 as long as you have the intention, right? But then it becomes, you know.
It's interesting though, because that demarcation, that either or of belief versus action, it makes me think about how if you're focused on action, you're focused on structure, it allows for that type of external control of the individual, so that you can have, you know, a centralized power that says, okay, this is how we do things, and if you're not doing them, then you're wrong.
Yes.
And when you get then to the point of, well, it's just belief, it's just intention, as long as you have it in your heart, it allows for that openness and fluidity that also can become chaotic in and of itself, because then you're not necessarily the same as anyone else. And I think about it in terms of getting back to like fandom and popular culture. When you have, let's say, a company that produces the texts,
Mhm.
they can have maybe more control over saying, well, this is how you express your fandom. This is how you express your beliefs about this text, is you have to buy these things, you have to act this way, so on and so forth. But
Absolutely.
if that's not the case, and the fans get to determine how their expression demonstrates their fandom, that can cause a lot more chaos, I would imagine.
Yes, it
Yeah.
can.
Yeah. I think, oh, no, please go ahead.
I've seen it in the fan fiction writing community that it causes a lot of chaos in it.
Yeah, it's that old gatekeeping, right? Everyone, it's that issue of gatekeeping, and even this was this idea of control, right? Was a popular focal point of sort of more Marxist inspired anthropologists looking at the process of ritual, saying like, well, this very particular set, doing it this way creates that form of social dominance, right? You're controlling the way people think, you're controlling the way people act. And if we think about fandoms where there's so much fluidity, so much variability within the way that people connect to a particular fandom, that anyone sort of trying to control it, even if it's the original creator trying to control it, right? It creates this backlash, which I'm sure there's a few fandoms that we could point at to talk about this, but for me personally, I grew up a hardcore Star Wars fan, right? Like Star Wars is I saw that earlier. I love it. It's very central to like my development as a youth. And seeing the things that have happened to it in the years since its original creation, especially after it was bought out by Disney and all that there is this reaction of like, okay, well, George Lucas doesn't really own it, Disney doesn't really own it, it's the fans that own it kind of concept, right? Like when something explodes to the level of fandom, where does the control of the situation really sit? Yeah.
It's complicated though, because in one hand, I'm not too happy about the way the direction Star Wars has gone either. And in one way, I believe that the fan should have some say in how the creation goes or how they do. But on the other hand, George Lucas and Disney and whoever owns it have a right to do whatever they want with it, because they're the creators, they're the ones who wrote it, it's their intellectual property. So it's just complicated. You need, there's a need to find in popular culture the middle ground.
Absolutely.
And yet this idea of the middle ground, have we ever had that in human history? Because I think about how, again, looking at the history of religion and looking specifically at Christianity, we've had that tug between the center and the outside for where is the control. And every time it seems that we have that tug, we have some type of schism come in and a new branch of Christianity seems to form. And I think we see the same thing in a fandom when it gets large enough, where you have these internal tensions. And if they get large enough, it causes those fractured fandoms, and those fandoms then splinter off and go off in their own directions. Have we ever, can you think of an example where having these types of organized, ritual, tradition-minded folks has ever led to people coming back together and finding common ground in a middle ground?
I haven't seen anything that suggests that people have coming around, because for example, if you give two examples of the fandom that has been having chaos, Lord of the Rings and Star Wars.
Mm.
The big division
Mhm.
with the original text, then we haven't seen anyone come back to it. You just see the extreme, oh, this is what Tolkien wanted, this is what it needs to be. And then there are those who say it's kind of fluid. Tolkien will agree with what is happening. And then you have Star Wars fans are saying that no, this should not be happening. But then you have George Lucas and Disney say, but the writer or we're creating this. This is what we should. The people who support the George Lucas way of dealing with recent Star Wars movies and merch, saying that this is George Lucas' work, he can do whatever he wants in it. So, and no one has seemed to come to that we can all find a middle ground.
Yeah, it's difficult. It really is, because especially when you get these very intense schisms and nobody wants to compromise because everyone thinks that they're right, right? Everyone's like, we are the ones who are right. It's hard. I mean, the only thing that I can think of, like, I can't think of necessarily any historical examples other than, like, you know, once again, so much of how we think about these in the West is defined by the, you know, sort of Abrahamic religions, which is very orthodoxy based, right? And like this sort of right and wrong way. Whereas if we looked at, you know, Asian religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, things like that, it's not as orthodoxy focused. There's a lot more allowance for sort of different opinions, different views, without saying this one is the only right and this one is the only wrong. But in pop culture, and I don't know, maybe think about this, but where I think of sort of differences of opinion always, and everybody always comes back to the same point, is sports. Right? Everybody wants to argue about whether the front office is making the correct decision, whether they should have traded this player, that player, you know, the team sucks, versus the people who are like, oh, you should never criticize your team or you're not a real fan. Regardless of where people sit, everybody still shows up at the stadium on the day of the match, right? Or everyone still sits down to watch the game on the day of the match and re-engage, because that's our classic like pop culture as religion example, right? Is sports. Regardless of how people feel about it, not everybody, but almost everybody, they still come back, right? They still come back to the activity, which is the ritual process of watching the game, right? Regardless of how they feel about the situation.
Which makes me think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was gonna say, I was agreeing that sports is the only one I could think of also that people come together in the middle ground.
Okay, but I'm just gonna keep playing this advocate, advocate position. So thinking again from a fandom studies perspective, we have the fan, the anti-fan concepts. And the idea of the anti-fan is someone who, you know, isn't necessarily happy with the fandom and what they're seeing in their object of affection. And yet they're largely still engaging in the consumption of that object because they might be hate watching or they might be doing it to be able to be critical of it, but they're still essentially consumers at the end of the day. And you come at it then from like a public relations marketing perspective, and the idea that, you know, there's no such thing as bad publicity. You still have people consuming, you still have people engaging. People are still going to watch the sports game unless they turn away from a fan or an anti-fan into a non-fan and they detach emotionally from it. And I think about how from a Catholic perspective, a Protestant or a Baptist or whatever may be more of, you know, the anti-fan. They're not the true fan. And yet they're still reaching the middle ground and thinking that there's some type of higher being out there. The bigger schism would be between someone like myself who's atheist and then someone who is a devout believer. Because then the only middle ground I could see is that, yes, I agree, life is chaotic and we need to figure out ways to live through it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree that while there is a schism between. Sorry about the noise in the background.
It's okay.
Fine.
While there is a schism in between in Christianity between Catholics and Protestants, the middle ground is the belief in a higher being. Just
Mhm.
that we have different ways of getting into the same ground, the same God.
Yeah.
Yeah, different means to the same end.
Yes.
Right, like at the end of the day, yeah, Protestant, Catholic, regardless of how they feel about each other, it's still getting to heaven. There's still God, there's still Jesus, there's still the Holy Spirit. All those foundational basics of belief are still there, right? And the same thing with sports or a fandom, right? Regardless of how one feels about the situation, about how one feels about, the team or the creators or whatever, we
Mhm.
still all go back to share in that same experience, right? We all still go back to the well to drink the water, regardless of how we get there.
Which makes me think that the commonality may be not the beliefs, of course, but the commonality is the emotion.
Yes. There's, very much that idea of embodiment, right? That becomes very particular to ritual studies, in that, it's not just about the belief per se, and not necessarily just about the action either, but the fusion of the two, right? How the belief is instilled in the body, right? How the belief is exampled through the actions of the body, and we are constantly sort of recreating the understandings of things through our physical world, and right, and through the things that we do on a physical basis, which was an attempt by like anthropologists and whatnot, religious studies people in like mid 20th century, to push back against the whole Cartesian dualism thing, right? The whole mind-body duality, and be like, no, these are connected. We can't just mind here, body there, right? They influence each other and they impact each other. So, we are constantly recreating our understandings of the world, even, just when we sit down to watch a movie, all right? When we watch Christmas movies at Christmas time, through this physical activity of watching and engaging, we are recreating and reliving, our particular understandings of, life, the universe, and everything.
I wouldn't say recreating, I would say reliving, because when we sit down doing the ritual of watching Christmas movies or going trick-or-treat during Halloween, we're not recreating the wheel, we're actually reliving. So I will disagree about the recreating parts.
No, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, because like when I think about using the term recreating here, I guess I wasn't necessarily thinking of it in the sense of like, like remaking the wheel, like just like starting over, but more in that sense of like reliving, like we are like over and over again, we are redoing this idea, right? We are replicating, I guess would be the better way, right? We are replicating the experience and reliving it, every time that we do it.
And yet every time we do it is never going to be like the first time. And again, when we think about this from the fan studies, if we repeatedly return to the same exact text, we're essentially trying to get the same feeling. We're trying to relive that thing that made us so happy.
Yes.
But you can never have that again because it was so unique to that time. So it makes me also wonder, a lot of the talk right now, and it has been for, I guess, a while, in popular culture and fandom studies, is that the role of nostalgia and the impact of nostalgia. So would you say that nostalgia plays a key part in why we engage with the rituals and traditions that we do?
Yes, I would say that because, as you said, nostalgia, a Power Rangers movie came a reunion kind of movie. It was released on Netflix, and those of us who grew up in the 90s and the 2000s, we watched Power Rangers, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers when we were little kids, and so when, even though we're all adults, those of us in the 90s and the 2000s, we're adults grown. And when we saw that, everybody was just talking about it because we wanted to relive that experience of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers.
Yes, absolutely. I watched it a couple days ago, and it is just cheesy 90s. Like, it was truly amazing how much it felt like one of those original Power Ranger episodes. They really got it spot on. Yeah, I mean, especially if we're talking pop culture as ritual, you know, personal ritual, like nostalgia 100% is so much at the core, right, of what's going on. There's a really great book that I just read last semester that I was using for a class called Consumed Nostalgia by Gary Cross. Highly, highly recommend. Really good book. You know, where he talks about the fact that particularly in the, you know, we can really tie it to the post-World War II America, right? That there is this obsession with nostalgia, this obsession sort of with connecting with the past, right? And trying to, relive once again, right? Relive these points in our mind, these points in our lives that are gone, that there is no getting back to, right? But we are trying to retouch, right? We're trying to find some sort of visceral way that we can recover those feelings, right? Which, on the one hand, as he does in the book, we can talk about how this is all 100% wrapped up in capitalist consumer culture, because we cannot separate pop culture and nostalgia from consumerism in America. But on the other hand, this also taps into the sort of religious-y aspect of pop culture ritual, right? So much of myth, right, and religious ritual is designed to bring us out of time, right, extempore, into, you know, sort of what religious studies scholars of an older time calls the religious time, right? We have worldly time, we have reality, right, temporal time, and then we have religious reality, right? So trying to tap into these things, right, going through the process of ritual, reliving these myths, is a way to pull us out of the physical and temporal world into the realm of religion, right, into the sort of higher sacred realm. And that's kind of the same thing that we're trying to do with nostalgia-based pop culture, right? We're trying to pull ourselves out of the grim, dirty reality in which we're living and try to touch back with some kind of golden age that only exists in the deep recesses of our mind.
Yes, I would agree with that. The Lord of the Rings versions, and there's another one, the Power Rangers movie, and there are several other remakes of movies and books that when we were kids loved and were happy, that are being recreated, relived. I'm using your word, recreated, relived, and nostalgia plays a part. And I think that's talking about the consumerism. I think that the powers to that be realizes that they can make money out of nostalgia, and so they bank on that.
But it's also interesting, this idea of, you know, an alternate time or an alternate reality, because I then go back to like Homo Ludens and the idea of the magic circle and the role of play and how you have to get into the playful mindset to be able to, you know, experience these alternatives and whatnot. And I also study professional wrestling, and like professional wrestling is alternate realities.
Yeah, absolutely. The old Roland Barthes mythologies. Yeah,
exactly. So it does bring up the point then that, I mean, a magic circle is only as good as the people's willingness to play along.
Sure.
So are rituals and traditions then only as impactful if people are willing to go along with them?
I think so. In the case Perhaps in case of religion, Catholicism, I think so. I mean, there's a reason why people are still doing those rituals 2,000 years later in the Catholic Church. There's a reason why people, even though I'm a recovering Catholic and I agree with it, some of the teachings that when I go to church, I get up and go and take communion.
Mm-hmm.
So without people continually doing that, there is no reason, no meaning to have those rituals and traditions.
Yeah. I mean, if people were just like really not into it and really not feeling it, then they wouldn't continue to exist, right? But this also kind of wraps back around to our discussion earlier about the sort of cognitive level, like maybe there's just something in our brains that just really wants this. And I think about one of our favorite things in modern pop culture, of course, which is memes, right? If we want to bring memes into the discussion, it's one of my favorite things to talk about with my students. I have like a whole presentation on like the history of memes. It's a lot of fun. But one of the things that's really surprising about it to like a lot of my students is when I tell them like this word has a specific definition, right? There's this guy Richard Dawkins, known for being a famous atheist, right? But back in 1976 he wrote this book called The Selfish Gene, blah 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 blah, in which he's trying to figure out why certain aspects of human culture continue to exist through this genetic framework, right? Using genetics as a base. And of course, even though he didn't necessarily bring it up at first, he was trying to explain why are humans still obsessed with religion, right? Is what he's trying to get at. But he was like, there's a meme was just the most basic social like unit, right? Taking like the EAM concept from linguistics. And so, that there's the thing about memes is that they're sort of symbolic, right? And that you recognize a meme, you understand it like a meme proper, right? You understand it without there being any text or anything, just because you know what it's about. And that's what makes it continue, right? Is because you can adapt, you can change it up, everybody can find some sort of way to use it and play around with it. And not, it's this kind of thing that makes it ever adaptable. And that's what allows it to continue, right? So even though on the one hand, we think of rituals perhaps as, or tradition for that matter, as these sort of rooted, set in stone kind of processes, at the end of the day, they're not, right? Yeah.
Reality is constructed. There's
Yes.
physicality and then there's realities on top of it. And I think like wrapping all the way back to the beginning, talking about animals, the rituals that we see in like mating dances and dominance displays and whatnot, those are rooted, I think, almost primarily in that physicality. They have true physical consequences on that animal or on that species. Whereas in human civilization at this point, our rituals don't really have that kind of life or death physical consequence anymore. They might have consequences in our existential nature, in our social, cultural, and connectiveness nature and things like that. But no one is going to die if they don't take communion, at least not that I'm aware of.
Well, in the West, West.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting to think about, sort of that concept of the like socialization and how it reflects in these actions of the body too, because I was just thinking here about another conversation that I recently had with my students, and we were talking about sort of alcohol in America. We're talking about alcohol in America, right? And America's relationship with alcohol. And one of the things that I brought up in because another thing we could talk about, right, is like rites of passage kind of things, right? Sort of more social based, functional. And I was like, what's one of the ways that we see alcohol really reflected in pop culture? And I was like, teen movies, right? That's like a rite of passage. It's like in every teen movie, you go to the party at someone's house, typically when their parents aren't there, right? They're throwing a rager, and the first experiences with alcohol, and to this point where you know, maybe because of pop culture, we see it as such this rite of passage that, you know, at some point in your high school years, you're going to go to a party, you're going to get drunk for the first time, da 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 da.
Mhm.
To which I was telling my students, like, you know, maybe that's kind of problematic, and maybe we're kind of normalizing teenage alcoholism at the same time. So, you know, does it also gets into this question, sort of like, you know, what Geertz talks about is models of something, right? And models for something. And how does pop culture reflect that idea, right? Modeling something that already exists versus setting up the model for, you know, how people should act or something like that.
That seems like a binary that might be useful analytically, but I can't imagine that if you model of something, it's not going to also act as a model for something.
Exactly. And that's where it comes back to, is
Yeah.
ultimately most of these are both, right? Especially
Yeah.
if we think of pop culture and things like that. You know, another example that I love to use is 80s movies, right? I love using 80s movies as an example of things. And, you know, if you think about a lot of the 80s action movies are these sort of hardcore, hyper masculine, you know, anti-communism, all this kind of thing. And, you know, at the one time, it's sort of just reflecting what's already going on in America during that time period. But at the same time, it's showing these images of like, this is how heroism works. This is how men work, right? This is how geopolitics works.
And it's interesting then, because getting back to like what Princess was saying about the love of things that from when we grew up, now you look at how the 80s nostalgia with Stranger Things and other pop culture texts, both are reflecting on those types of models, but in other ways subverting them because of more modern models. But I also love this discussion because it helps me to understand maybe why we're seeing such pushback in the United States right now on trans and drag, because it is being seen as being normalized, and people whose rituals don't allow for that type of thing don't want it to be normalized.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, ideology playing such a huge role in that discussion.
Yeah, because people who are pushing back against trans and LGBT community, they grew up in the 50s, 40s, 60s, that when gay men, lesbian women had to hide, non-binary had to hide who they were.
Yeah.
So you see a lot of older men and older women coming out as lesbians and gay, because back then they had to hide who they are.
Yeah.
Yes. Even though it's so interesting, which I know this is something that people bring up occasionally in trying to push back against, you know, a lot of the anti-trans rhetoric and anti-trans ideology, is that, you know, you can find so many things of, you know, sort of trans or, you know, just LGBTQ representations in pop culture. And of course, you know, and people are like, well, you didn't have any problem when, you know, Robin Williams is dressing up in drag and, you know, doing a comedy bit, you know, so why do you have a problem with here, right? And of course, we could say like, oh, there's a fine line between trans and, you know, Robin Williams and Mrs. Doubtfire, right? Like there's, you know, a definite difference there, but it does bring up these ideas of what in this case is sort of that fluidity again, right? That there's fine lines that people use to define particular aspects of culture and society, and that, you know, this one particular side of society has drawn these very particular lines, wherein like, this is okay, but even though this action shares a lot of similarities with this action over here, you know, the purpose or the function of these two actions are different enough to say like, this is fine and this is not fine, right? But once again, it also becomes that representation aspect of, well, in sort of keeping up appearances, right? That if you are trying to, you know, be a part of this particular group, you know, you're trying to be part of the in-group, right? Or if you're just trying to even say, you know, appeal enough to the in-group that you can get enough votes to stay in office, right? that it becomes less about what you actually believe and brings us back around to the performance aspect, right? The key is that you are performing in the way that people expect you to perform. And that's the only thing that matters, right? Is perception, right? I guess perception is the key part of this discussion.
Which I think a lot of times with rituals, when they're operating in that type of public fashion where other people can see it, a lot of times the ritual may just be performance, because the meaning isn't necessarily about the personal existential aspect, but it is about the social cultural.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, national holidays, right? Independence Day, anything like that. Perfect example of that sort of outward performativity as the key, right? Or if we also want to talk about LGBTQ and consumerist culture together, we can talk about how corporations trot out all their nice little pride flag designs in June, right? To be like, we care too, please continue to buy our products.
Yeah. Another thing I've talked about with my students that they're
sure.
Oh yeah.
But the thing about it, like with the drag and the trans argument, even with the drag queen shows, which is now really big in popular culture, the people who are against trans and who are supposedly not against drag are equating that if you bring your child to the now popular drag shows, that this child will want to be trans or gay. So even then, in the popular culture sphere, they are against this because they equate it as being trans.
Well, and largely it's also not wanting boys to be this way. It's not so much girls, and we're worried about girls. We're worried about boys because it's that fear of the loss of masculinity in this country.
Absolutely. And I was reading a book recently, and there's a chapter that talks about this sort of issue of, homosexuality from both male and female, right? Talking about like society's response to gayness versus lesbianness, right? And, everyone's super concerned with men being gay and men, engaging in same-sex love, throughout history, discussion, debate, all these different things. But when it comes to lesbian activity, everyone's like, it's not great, I guess, but there's nowhere near as much discussion of it, right? Nowhere near
there is discussion.
There is discussion, but when
it's more sexualized. Oh, let me jump in.
Yes, no, absolutely, right? Because there's obviously living in a patriarchal world, in a patriarchal society, there's such the obsession of men not being men, right? And the downfall of masculinity and rabble, right?
And so I think, we have to wrap up here. I could keep going, but
absolutely.
I think part of the interesting thing to take away from here maybe is how an understanding of ritual could help us to interrogate these cultural conflicts that we see and manifesting in popular culture and fandoms, but popular culture to an extent is kind of everywhere. So it manifests in all these ways, and how you have these conflicting ideas about rituals helping us to understand some of the struggle that is going on right now, because we have people who maybe are trying to establish new rituals, normalize things that are normal for them, and you have other people who are very staunch in their traditions and what they think their rituals are and what their rituals are good. And it just seems we've got these tensions going on that maybe have always existed in human civilization, but now we see them more because of all the media of our lives.
Yeah, I was just going to say the one thing that we didn't really talk about that would, definitely sort of spout off a whole new hour of discussion would be, thinking about that performativity aspect and, how social media, of course, just heightens the performativity aspect to the nth degree. And, how that probably creates its own particular huge set of answering that why question, right? Like, why do we see these things particularly happening the way they are now? And, we could talk about like social media as ritual performativity and that whole kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we can go into the conversation how people blame social media for all the hate and stuff that's happening in pop culture, when it's not that social media is to blame, but it happened back then without social media. But now that social media, people just gives people the audacity and the boldness to
Yes.
with the public.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Well, this might have to be a topic that we revisit then at some point.
That'd be lovely. That'd be lovely. Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both for coming in. I had a lot of great ideas, and I hope you all got something out of this discussion as well. And we will see everyone back for our next popular culture dialogue at the end of May. I believe it's on popular music. So something I don't know anything about. So I'm looking forward to listening to smart people.
Sounds fantastic.
Wonderful. Have a good one, you both.
Take care, everybody.